Hello, everybody. We'll give it a couple minutes for people to sign up. I'm a little early anyway, so.
Good afternoon.
Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. You are here. Appreciate y'all being here and being here on time. So we are going to do the same thing we did last exam. I think it's cruel and unusual to make you all do and explain it to the media quiz right after you had a exam. So that will be on Wednesday instead. So just so you know why I'm not starting with that. So I wanted to, I know I've been doing this a lot, but I think it helps us all to like remember where we are and things. I'm going to screen share the syllabus real quick, just again, to keep us all on the same page, to realize everything we've got coming up. So we're going to start covering memory today. So your Learn Smart module's due today. If you didn't get it in by now, do it by the end of the day. You do have some Connect assignments. I know some of you have started those already. And then we're only doing a week on memory, and we're doing a week on thinking, intelligence, and language next week. And then development gets 2 weeks because you'll see the chapter is giant, right? There's a lot of information. So you'll have a little bit more breathing room there. But then after we finish covering development, it's time for Thanksgiving break. And then after that, you come back, you take exam 3, and then we review for the final, and then you take your cumulative final exam after that. So there's really not that much time left in the semester, so make sure you're keeping up with those Connect assignments. Make sure that you're doing your psychology experience credits. I think there are like 8 or 9 studies on SONA right now. Make sure that you are signing up for those. A lot of them are just surveys you take online that might take you 15 to 20 minutes. So you can knock them out pretty quickly and then write your reaction to them. And guidelines for all that are on the syllabus. So you do have, how much of the total grade is the final? Good question. Okay, so I think you have 1,200 points for the semester and the final is 200. So whatever percentage that is. I'm bad at percentages off the top of my head. Here we go. I'll pull up a calculator and actually figure it out. Yeah, if the assignment due dates are wrong, don't worry about it. Just do them. And I'm, I know that I've screwed up a couple of them. So just do them and turn them in the day it was supposed to be. You won't get points off. So thanks for pointing that out though. Connect does not actually make things easy on the professor end. So, I do the best I can. So the final's about 17% of your entitled grade. So it's not as much as you would think. So the Connect assignments really probably make up the majority of your grade. So please prioritize those as it's coming out. All right, any questions about what's coming up? We're in the home stretch now, believe it or not. And just think, when all of your classmates are freaking out about going remote, you'll be like, we've been remote all semester. Dr. Myers has got this down, so you won't need to worry about it. So no big deal. And we'll just keep doing what we have been doing, basically. So it'll be pretty easy for us. Okay, I'm just giving credit to a couple people for being here. Again, you don't get any sort of points for this, but it is how I watch for patterns and I check in on you if you're missing a lot, basically. Make sure everybody's okay with this COVID era. All right, so today we are going to start talking about memory. We have some fun interactive things that we'll do as part of this PowerPoint. So I'm just going to screen share here real quick. Sorry, I have to use both screens, and sometimes that's a little bit annoying. And I'll get out my chat in case anybody needs to go. And I am going to go ahead and get myself all set up here. Okay. So what we'll be talking about now is memory in general, but in particular, how do we remember things and why don't we remember things sometimes? So we'll talk about some of these things. Yeah, a lot of people's memories are not that great, so I totally feel you in the chat. Yeah, in particular, perspective memory, which is remembering something you have to do in the future. Humans are notoriously bad at this. So this is why it's important to use a planner or the calendar in your phone, because we just don't do well with that typically. There we go. So what is memory? We'll start by defining it here. Human memory is an information processing system. So it works constructively to encode, store, and retrieve information. And we're going to talk in detail about each of those steps as we go through this lecture. So encoding is getting it in there. Storing is, keeping it in there. And retrieval is when you need it, being able to pull it out. And obviously, all those steps are important. So it's a cognitive system, a system of thinking, essentially, that processes, encodes, and stores information we learn, and again, hopefully later lets us retrieve it. That is the goal, right? Everyone's probably had the experience where you get to an exam and you go, oh, I can remember remembering this, but I can't actually remember. That sounded weird out of context, but you know what I mean. Which reminds me, I did grade your exams, and y'all did really well this time. The average was an 81. 9 people got A's, 10 people got B's, 9 people got C's, and 2 people got D's. So much, much better than last time. You all know my style now, and you did great. So kudos to y'all. These are the things that human memory is good at. So we're good at remembering stuff we're paying attention to. And this seems sort of is that something that should be obvious? But it's not to most people. And the best example I usually use, and of course I don't have them up here, but I usually take out my keys and use them as an example. So, let's just pretend this tissue box is my keys, because that's what I have. So let's say I come home from work, I've had a really long day, right? And so I take my keys and I just sort of check them. And I don't pay attention to where I put them, right? So the next morning I go to look where I usually keep my keys and they're not there. And then I try to remember where I put them, but I didn't remember where I put them now because I didn't pay attention in the first place, right? So you've got to pay attention to something in order to remember it. Another thing that human memory is good at is focusing on information in which we are interested. So if there's something you're really interested in, for some people it might be sports, for other people it might be, the arts or numbers, things along those lines. We're really good at remembering that stuff. Like my husband loves not just sports in general, but sports statistics. His degree is in statistics, and he actually worked as a sports statistician while we were in college. Um, and so he can remember the most random facts about things, right? But if he's not paying attention when I say something, he doesn't remember what I said, right? That's pretty rare. He's pretty good about listening. But, so we remember stuff in which we're interested. We also remember information that arouses us emotionally or is really emotionally salient to us. So example would be, something that really angers us or something that scares us, right? We tend to remember that. The example I use here is that when I was, I think, in like 5th or 6th grade, my mom was driving and we got rear-ended like while we were driving. We were at stop. This guy was just like going 35 miles per hour, didn't pay attention, rear-ended us, and then took off. And my mom asked me to memorize his license plate. Like to this day, I remember his license plate was 583UGG because I was so scared in the moment and so like hyper focusing that I remembered it for her. We also more easily remember information that fits with our previous experiences, right? So if we have learned something a certain way, or we have learned something using a certain framework or opinion, it's a lot easier for us to remember new information that fits with that. We tend to ignore information, and that's not pay attention to, going back to our first point here, that doesn't fit with our worldview and doesn't fit with what we already know. And this is why it can be so hard to change people's minds politically, for example, which reminds me, a week from tomorrow is election day. If you haven't already voted, make sure that you vote. Very important. But we essentially kind of tune out the stuff that doesn't match. Even if we try to remember it, if we've already sort of learned something one way, that's hard to unlearn it, if that makes sense. So I admittedly have had to retrain myself to say Kamala Harris's name, for example, because in my mind I read it first as Kamala, and it's very disrespectful, obviously, to pronounce anyone's first or last name incorrectly. So I've had to retrain myself to pronounce it correctly. We also remember information we rehearse. So if anyone's ever been in a play and you have to learn your lines, right? Or you've had to memorize a song for something, or if you've played a sport, yeah, for sure, it's Kamala. So it's not just me, but it doesn't make it necessarily any, we should try to say people's names correctly, which is why I try so hard to get your names right, and I feel so bad when I get y'all's names incorrect. So apologies in advance when I do that. But yeah, so, if we learn things the wrong way, it's hard to unlearn it. And information that we rehearse is part of the reason why, right? If we rehearse something the wrong way, then we're going to remember that. But yeah, if you've been in a play, played a musical instrument, played a sport, right? Things that you do over and over that you practice are what gets in there. And I think that's also part of why I still remember that license plate is because I rehearsed it all the way to the police station. I was just repeating it to myself over and over. 583UGG, 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 right, so that it gets in there. So stuff that we practice, we're more likely to remember. Yes, Nick, that's a perfect way of saying it. Practice makes permanent, not perfect. Exactly. So just because you remember something doesn't mean you're remembering it correctly, unfortunately. The human memory is fallible. But this rehearsal is why I have you all do the Connect assignments, especially the Learn Smart modules. I know they're annoying, but they help you all get the information in there. And it's also why I have you all do the quizzes before our exams on Connect, because that rehearsal is really important. There's actually some really cool research that McGraw-Hill has done that shows that people that use the Connect assignments score better on in-class exams. So that's the other reason why I have you all do it. Alrighty, so we know that memory has to do with storing and retrieval of information, but how does all that actually work? Well, one helpful model of human memory is that of a computer-like information processing system. So this model was proposed originally by Atkinson and Shiffrin, and I believe they proposed it in the 70s, so when computing really started to get quite popular. So according to their three-stage model, both human and computer memory must do these 3 steps that we've already mentioned. So encoding is converting information into a form that can be used in memory. So converting information into a form that can be entered into memory is encoding. Encoding is converting information into a form that can be used in memory. Storage involves retaining that information over varying periods of time, right? So sometimes you just need to remember it for the exam the next day, and then it might kind of go out of your head. Sometimes you remember things for years, like that stupid license plate number I've remembered since I was in 6th grade, right? So more than half my life. So that's encoding. Sorry, that's storage. So storage is retaining information over varying periods of time. Retaining information over varying periods of time. So just holding it in your mind. And if anyone's seen the movie Inside Out, the Pixar movie, this is like when they're looking at the memory balls and the workers are like cleaning out the old ones. Like, oh, you don't need this anymore, right? So that is part of storage, is that it's not always permanent. And then retrieval has to do with locating and accessing specific information when you need it later on. So locating and accessing specific information when it's needed at later times. So again, a lot of times when we're talking memory, we just talk about the encoding into storage phase, but retrieval is super important, right? If you get it into long-term memory and then you can't get it out later, it doesn't do you any good, right? So we need that retrieval process to be spot on. So we're going to go into each process in more detail. And we'll start by encoding. So encoding involves modification of information to fit the preferred format of the memory system. So the first step is to pay attention to it, as we already mentioned, right? So this is the first step of getting information into memory. We've got to pay attention to it in some way, shape, or form. Generally, people need to pay attention to stimuli in order to remember them. Attention involves focusing awareness on a narrowed range of stimuli or events, right? So there's a lot going on around me right now, right? So I've got my light going, I've got the PowerPoint, I've got your chat. My cat was making noise downstairs a couple minutes ago. Who knows what he's into? And then out my window, I actually live on the fairway of a golf course, a golf hole, so I can like see golfers going by, right? If I were to try to attend to all that at once and like remember something one of you asked me, for example, I would never be able to do it. So you have to like selectively pay attention to what's going on. You have that narrowed range. So according to Craik and Lockhart, whether or not we will be able to remember something depends on how deeply we process the information. Yeah, Lara, go ahead.
I was going to ask, what does your body do if they're having trouble with the information, like when it's dark and you can't see anything? Is that what causes? What do they do to fill in the gaps?
Good question. Yeah. So sometimes we just won't be able to pay attention to things, right? Or sometimes we'll use other modalities, right? So we've talked about sensation and perception. We can use things like our sense of touch, our sense of smell, our sense of hearing, right, in those situations. But yeah, if we can't see it, we can't remember it, right? So
I meant if you can't see it very well.
If you can't see it very well, you might remember it incorrectly. And that's another thing that can happen. Again, like memory is fallible, so you can only get it in there as well as you can perceive it, if that makes sense. You can sense it and perceive it. So yeah, that certainly makes a difference. Yeah, Elijah, go ahead.
I don't know if you're going to talk about this later or not, but how does like trauma play with memory? Because I know like if you have like traumatic experiences or something, is it actually possible to push something out of your memory, like forcibly remove something from?
Good question. Yeah, so we actually don't cover this in this particular lecture. So sorry, I'm like going ahead when I mean to go back. Let me use this. But I'm glad to talk about it because trauma does affect your memory, particularly if you develop PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, or acute stress disorder, which is like the precursor to PTSD. So yeah, what happens when you have a traumatic experience is actually a whole cascade of things happen in your brain. And some of those things will actually impede your ability to remember things well. And essentially what happens is like you'll remember sort of snapshots of what happened. The best description I've seen of it from one of the really good researcher in trauma is it's like if you wrote down what happened to you in your trauma on Post-it notes that have all lost their stick, right? And then you stand up and they all fell on the floor and someone tells you, okay, tell me what happened in order. You're like, I have no idea, right? So that obviously can be problematic when you go to like report something to the police because you can't say things the way they expect you to. And it can sort of, your brain tries to protect you. So there's a process Freud came up with called repression. You sort of stick stuff in the back of your memory. And now this sounds great and this sounds like a coping mechanism and it does sort of protect you initially. But like the example I give is like, let's say that this piece of paper here is a bill that I got, right? And I got this bill and I don't actually have the money for it. So I just take my desk drawer and I open it and I put it in there and I close it, right? Out of mind, out of sight. I'm done, right? Well, maybe a month later, I go to get a pen and I'm like, oh, the bill I never paid, right? And that's what can happen in trauma is like you're not anticipating remembering it, but something can bring it back up for you. So when we say the word trigger or triggered, that's been sort of become like something we sort of poo-poo in popular psychology, right? And that actually has a meaning clinically for people with PTSD, where something can actually trigger them remembering that memory that they might not have even realized they had to that sense of detail. And that something can be, you know, a smell. So I worked a lot with Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom vets while I was at the VA for a year. And for my Iraqi vets, they talked about how the smell of sand would bring back the desert and bring back things for them. For a lot of Vietnam era vets, it is a car backfiring because it sounds like a gunshot to them and they'll hit the deck. If you were sexually assaulted, it might be you're involved in a consensual sexual experience with a partner and something brings it back, right? So yeah, memory essentially gets piecemealed and your brain tries to protect you, but it can't do it 100%. So it'll come back at really inconvenient times sometimes. Yeah, that's a really, really good question because it's very different. Yeah, and Nick is saying in the chat, if we can't perceive it, our brain does make up something to fill in a gap, which is really true. Depression can also affect your memory, yes, and depression can actually cause what we call like cognitive slowing, where you process things much more slowly, which makes it more difficult to remember and to respond quickly. Yes, Michaela is saying she remembers, you know, them requiring her to remember a long a word and she still remembers it to this day. Yeah, that can definitely happen as well, right? This happened to me when I was in high school, as because a lot of high schoolers go through. I had a bout with depression and I went to see a psychiatrist and he gave me one of those types of things. And I still remember the 3 words were red ball chair, right? Because again, like I got it into long-term memory. So yeah, really, really good question, Elijah. It's pretty complex and we're still trying to figure it all out. But trauma really can mess with your memory and your ability to remind it, which again, if you're trying to report a crime, can work against you, unfortunately, if you have law enforcement agents who don't understand these brain processes. So a lot of psychologists who work in this area are trying to do education for those individuals so they understand it better. Great question. Anxiety, I should also mention, can also affect your memory, because if you're so much paying attention to what you're anxious about, you might not hear or pay attention to other things. Pretty much anything can. Obviously, if you're schizophrenic and you're hearing voices, that can interfere with things. If you have an eating disorder and you're just so hungry that you can't focus on anything else, right? So a lot of psychological disorders can influence your ability to think clearly, process things well, and thus remember them well. But I think trauma is one of the clearest examples of where it directly messes with your brain. And like, heaven forbid you had drugs or alcohol in your system at the same time, because obviously that's going to mess it up even more. Yeah, really good question. Where was it? Oh, I was talking about Craig and Lockhart. So whether or not we'll be able to remember something depends on how deeply we process that information. So this is this idea of levels of processing. So incoming information is processed at different levels. The deeper the processing, the longer lasting it is in your memory. So like the encoding is essentially more rich and you remember it better. I'm looking in the comments. We have some other great comments, it looks like here. Oh yeah, if you, had experienced a trauma, all kinds of things can set it off. So having experienced the Boston Marathon, fireworks going off, yeah, being in a city like that. Yes, Carter, there's only a certain number of things we can remember, which we'll get to in this lecture. It's essentially like 7 plus or minus 2. And once we get beyond that, we're not great at remembering things. And fabricated memories. Oh, good question. So we're going to do a little bit with that in our demos, but essentially suggestion part of it. And other things that can lead to fabricated memories are if you had something in a similar experience to someone else, or you heard someone else's story, right? That can be pieces of it. Yeah, Elizabeth Loftus is a psychological researcher who's done a lot with this, where they'll like tell people, hey, your parents told us when you were little you got lost at a shopping mall. And people will tell like very clear stories about it when it never happened. So yeah, sometimes it's just like a suggestion of things, or like you should remember this, right? And then like we as humans don't like to admit when we don't remember things, so our brain kind of fills in the gaps. And then sometimes it's like context cues can mess you up and make you misremember something as well. You guys are asking great questions. Awesome. And obviously, if you've only encoded something at the shallow level, the structural level, that'll be problematic. And then the phonemic level, so the intermediate, and the semantic is deep. And that might all sound confusing right now, but never you worry. We've got a whole slide explaining about it. All right, so example is, let's say you had to remember the word dog. Right, so a structural feature would be this word is written in capital letters, right? That's not going to help you that much, because like pretty much any word could just be written in capital letters, right? The intermediate or phonemic has to do with like the sound of the word. So you might think about it rhyming with ball, right? But that still isn't perfect, because it could also be log, right? Or jog, lots of different things. Slog through the bog. And then the deep semantic is what actually helps us remember things. So it is the blank was barking at the cat, right? Okay, we can fill it in, that was dog. So if you think about like what the thing actually is, or there's some research showing like if you picture the thing, if it's a thing, that can really help too. So if you get a picture of a dog in your memory, that might help you. So how can we get better at memory, right? And some of you might be thinking, man, Dr. Meredith, why don't you do this chapter first? So the help for exams. Fair. I just go by the direction the book goes in, but maybe I should reorganize. So elaboration is a type of encoding in which the meaning is added. So when you're trying to get to that deeper semantic encoding. So the meaning is added to information so that it can be more easily stored and retrieved later. So the stimulus, whatever you're looking at, trying to remember, is linked to other information when you encode it. For example, let's say you were studying phobias for a psychology test in like abnormal psych. And you would apply the information to your own fear of spiders. That is important because you've given it context, right? You're thinking of examples. So elaboration is often thinking of examples. And what we found is that self-generated examples that you can tie to your own life, your own history, tend to help us remember things better because we're pretty much the best at remembering things about ourselves. And it's not because we're all like narcissists. It's just, it's relevant to our lives, so it's easy. Visual imagery involves the creation of visual images to represent the words. So just like I talked about, like having a picture of a dog in your mind, right? You can do this in a lot of different examples, different contexts. So concrete words are obviously easier, right? So trying to envision, apple is a lot easier than if I told you to create an image for, equality, right? That one's a little more abstract. Justice, maybe you could think of like the scales. Liberty, maybe the Statue of Liberty. But when you get to something like equality, maybe just the equal sign, right? Like it gets pretty abstract. Dual coding theory holds that memory is enhanced by forming semantics, so those deep processing, or visual codes. Either of those things can lead to recall. And obviously, if you do both, even more helpful. Organization in the encoding process also can help. So chunking is where organizational items, you're organizing items, putting too many syllables on words. So you organize items into manageable units, so into chunks of information. And then hierarchies are where you organize information into hierarchies composed of broad concepts divided and subdivided into narrower concepts. And again, just like trying to imagine a picture for equality, right? It's sort of hard to envision chunking and hierarchies without examples. So I do have them. Alrighty. So I am going to read some letters out loud, and then I want you all to write them down for yourselves. If you have a pen and paper, go for that. If you have, just open a Word document or something and type them in there. Don't put them in the chat because then everybody will see them. Okay, so this is just to do for yourself. So I'm going to read the letters, and I'm going to read them the way a psychologist who was giving a memory test would, which is with 1 second in between each. So X, I, B, M, C, I, A, F, B, I, C, B, S, M, T, V. All right, so write down as many of those as you can remember. So there were 16 letters. So did anybody get all 16? I'm guessing probably not. It would be pretty hard because of that plus or minus 2 thing, right? So now what I'm going to do is show you how chunking can help you remember information like that. So now I'm going to read you the exact same, you lost me after like 5. That's pretty common. Again, that's within that plus or 7 plus or minus 2, right? Now I'm going to show you how chunking can make it easier. So I'm going to read the exact same letters, but I'm going to read them in a different way. Okay, so helps if I start with the letter X was the first letter. X, IBM, CIA, FBI, CBS, MTV. Easier? You can write in the chat your reactions to this. Oh, good question. Yeah, typically you wait till the psychologist finishes saying all the letters and then you write them down. I didn't make that clear, so I apologize. But this is, I'm not actually testing your memory. We're just doing a demonstration, so it's okay. So yeah, that should be a lot easier. Oh no, sorry, Carter. But yeah, if you have them in chunks, like IBM, CIA, right? Those are acronyms we're familiar with. Basically what I did is I took it from 16 letters down to 6 chunks of information. So in theory, it should be easier to do the second part. So that's chunking. It's also why when we like try to remember phone numbers, and not a lot of us have to do that anymore, right? Because we just have them all programmed in our phones. Back in the day, when we had to memorize phone numbers, we would do it in 3 chunks instead of all the digits. So, for example, my parents' phone number when I was growing up, which I can give you because they don't live there anymore, was 734-981-6474. And I can still remember that because to me, that's 3 pieces of information, right? If I tried to remember each of the digits individually, that gets harder. This is also why when you look at credit card numbers, they're chunked into like 4s, right? 4 sets of 4. Easier for you to read off if you have to read it over the phone to someone. Easier for them to remember those little chunks. So psychology is all kinds of places you didn't even know. So this next slide is an example of a hierarchy. So for example, if you wanted to look at the psychoactive drugs that we talked about in the chapter on consciousness, you might put them into categories of stimulants, depressants, hallucinogens, and then put them in under those categories as well, right? So under hallucinogens, you have LSD, ecstasy, and marijuana. So sometimes that's helpful, but if there's not an easy hierarchy, right, then that's less helpful. All right, so we've talked about encoding, but now we're going to talk about storage. So storage is what it sounds like. It's storing things, retaining things over time. And so what we're trying to retain is this encoded material that we just spent all this effort encoding, right, during the first step. So it involves retention of encoded material over time. And so the analogy here is information storage in computers, right? It's similar to the information storage in human memory, right? So if any one of you own like flash drive, thumb drive, whatever they call it in this day and age, right? That's an example of external storage. Your computer has a hard drive. There's your internal storage, right? If you're storing something for a big company, you might have servers like are shown here. And actually, when computers first started, which I think I referenced in our research methods lecture, these servers would be like what the computer looked like. Basically, like one computer would be these giant things that would do simple calculations. We have much more computing power now, right? This has much more power than what they had to go to the moon on the Apollo missions, right? Little mind-boggling. We were playing Among Us with some of our friends on Saturday night, and I had to go get something out of the room. And I was like, well, luckily, I'm doing it on mobile. I could just take it with me. And I was like, the power of the sun in the palm of my hand. A little Doc Ock reference for those of you who like Spider-Man. right? It's really kind of impressive what we have a ability to access. And the human brain is equally impressive in terms of its storage capacity when you look at the fact that, like, that's not really that much space, right? If anyone remembers the old movie Jerry Maguire, right? There's something like the human head weighs 8 pounds. Like, it's not that much if you think about our overall mass, right? So it's really kind of impressive what we can do. So Plato and Aristotle compared memory to a block of wax that differed in size and hardness for various individuals, and that remembering was like stamping an impression into the wax. And that makes sense with the technology they had at the time. But today, our analogies have become much more sophisticated because our technology has become much more sophisticated. And as our technology continues to evolve and grow, I'm sure that our analogies for information processing will continue to evolve and grow as well. So the storage process is actually fairly simple. You get it in there, it tends to stay in there unless it's been too long and doesn't seem relevant. And then you do have some memory decay, or unless you have some sort of accident, disease, what have you, that will actually attack. And this is what happens in dementia, like Alzheimer's dementia, for example. So access and retrieval is the vital part of memory. It involves the location and recovery of that information from memory. So you're pulling it back out. Without it, memory isn't actually helpful because we can't access what we remember. And if we can't do that, we can't actually work with the material and use it to our benefits. Again, we've all had this experience on an exam, right? Where you want that information and it just won't come out. So you're like, I know I put it in there, but maybe you just didn't encode it with deep enough strategies, right? Maybe you were just at that shallow level, so it's hard to find it. So we're going to talk more about retrieval later in this lecture. So this is a really nice diagram I like in terms of the processes of memory. So again, you encode it, you put it into memory, and then you store it, you hold it in your memory. And then you recover it from your memory. So again, hopefully, ideally, if you've encoded it properly, right? Again, we know the human memory isn't perfect. We just showed it with our letters, right? So we're going to go back to Atkinson and Strickland. So not only did they talk about, the stages of memory, but they also talked about different memory systems. The idea that we have different ways of processing information as we need to, basically. So they proposed an analogy between information storage by computers and information storage in human memory. And this is the information processing approach. And basically, this approach divides memory into 3 different stores or basic memory systems. So sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. And so sensory memory is the very temporary storage of information. Very quick, I believe it's 10 seconds or less. Might even be shorter. No, I think sensory memory is like a second or 2. And it provides temporary storage of information brought to us by our senses. So all those senses we learned about last exam period, sight, smell, hearing, all of that stuff is held very briefly in sensory memory. It has a large capacity for information, but it only lasts, here's my time amounts, from 1/4 of a second up to 3 seconds. So I was kind of in the middle with my 1 second. 1/4 of a second up to 3 seconds. Very short amount of time, right? If you've ever watched someone use sparklers on 4th of July at night, right? You kind of like can write with them and trace things. That little like trail of light behind them is a nice analogy for sensory memory. It's like it's there for a very brief amount of time and then it's gone, right? So, and the reason for that is because there's a lot of sensations coming to us all at once, right? And it's not always relevant for us to remember all of them, right? So we will only try to push along the ones that are relevant and helpful and important. So short-term memory, which is also abbreviated STM, holds few items briefly. So sensory memory holds a lot of stuff, but extremely briefly, again, 1/4 second to 3 seconds. Short-term memory holds a few things very briefly, less briefly though, so up to 30 seconds is about our short-term memory limit. So it holds these relatively small amounts of information for brief periods of time, 30 seconds or less. This is what you use when, say, you look up a phone number on your phone and it's really annoying because on the website they don't have it, so you can just push the link and it'll dial it. I hate that. I don't know about you all, I hate that. Like, just make it so I can dial it. So instead you have to like memorize it while you open up your phone dialing app, right? That's short-term memory. You use that to get the phone number over, essentially, and then you let it go. However, if there's something in short-term memory that's important, then you might practice it, and you might try to encode it, and you might try to move it to long-term memory. And long-term memory is that storage phase of memory. So it's permanent and limitless. And again, sometimes it will fade for various reasons that we've talked about. But in general, you can store as much as you want back there. It allows us to retain large amount of information for very long periods of time. So again, I think we start making memories that we can remember as adults when we're like 4 or 5. So we can remember that all the way till we die, right? A lot of information, a lot of memory space up there, giant hard drive for ourselves. So we're going to talk about each of these in a little bit more detail as well. So sensory memory preserves brief sensory impressions of stimuli. So sometimes this is also called the sensory register, because it's like we're just registering it as it goes on. Psychologists believe that in this stage, memory takes the form of essentially neural activity in the sense organs. It's essentially moving from sensation to perception. That's sort of what's happening here. It's basically information preserved in its original sensory form for a very brief time. It allows the sensation to linger briefly after sensory stimulation is over. Alrighty. So on the next slide, you're going to see a series of letters for 1 second. And this is on me to count a second and then click. So hopefully I can do it well. So after this, I'm going to have you write down as many as you can remember. So pay attention. I'm going to click it here in 3, 2, 1. Oh, not helpful. Try to remember as many as you can. So I'll click it in 3, 2, 1. Alrighty. So write down as many letters as you can remember. Some of you may feel like you didn't even see anything, right? It was super short. So how many can you recall? Go ahead and type in the chat if you can recall quite a few. You can't remember any, that's common. 3 is pretty good. The first 3, yeah. Yeah, and we'll talk about why we tend to remember the first and the last things the most for things later on in this lecture, probably Wednesday. Okay, people are remembering these here. I'll throw them up. Yeah, it looks like you remember quite a few of them. So yeah, it's such a short amount of time, it's almost impossible for us to memorize all 9, right? But because you wrote it down right away, you just used that sensory memory. And so you did probably remember more than if you tried to like purposely make yourself memorize. So the actual capacity of sensory memory can be 12 or more items, so more than our working memory. But all but 3 or 4 items will just disappear before they can enter short-term memory and go on to long-term memory. Because again, we just can't hold that much in our short-term memory. And there's a separate sensory register for each sense. And because we're psychologists and we like to give things fancy names, we have fancy names for them. All right, so the visual sensory memory is the icon. So this is the after image like we talked about with the sparklers, like you can see in the picture down in the corner here. The auditory sensory memory is called the echo, pretty obviously, right? There's probably others as well. So, we probably have one for smell, we probably have one for taste, we probably have one for touch, right? We haven't given like fancy names to all of those quite yet. Very large capacity, very short duration. The echo is about 250 milliseconds. So, or that's the icon, sorry. And the echo is about 1 to 2 seconds. So very, very, very short. Visual and auditory sensory stores appear to decay about a quarter of a second after that. So they gone, right? We're just not going to remember them. So next we're going to talk about working memory. So working memory preserves recently perceived events or experiences for less than a minute without rehearsal. Again, this is called short-term memory as well. And also called working memory. So those two terms are used interchangeably. Some modern cognitive psychologists argue that working memory and short-term memory are two different things. So when you take, if those of you who decide to be psych majors, take Dr. Ariel's cognition class in coming years, you'll probably learn whatever the most recent theory is about working versus short-term memory. But for now, kind of understand they're fairly interchangeable. So working memory or short-term memory is a mental workspace where we sort and encode information before we put it in more permanent storage. It's essentially kind of like a quality control at a factory, right? Stuff kind of rolls by and we just decide whether or not it's worth keeping or whether we need to scrap it. So information is stored for somewhere around 20 to 30 seconds. But if you rehearse it, it leads to a longer duration. You'll get encoded into long-term memory. And I've mentioned our magic number 7, plus or minus 2, several different times. This is the limited capacity of short-term memory. Again, take out your piece of paper, your Word doc, whatever you're writing on, and part of this will actually be familiar to you based on what you said in the chat. I'm guessing they probably give you a very similar test. So I'm going to read you a string of unrelated numbers, and your task is to memorize the numbers in the exact order presented. So not just like which numbers, but in the order presented. So I'm going to start pretty easy with 4 numbers, and then we're going to go up from there. And like I said before, I'm going to do the same thing where I read them with a second in between, just like a psychologist would were they giving you a memory test. So our first one is 2, 8, 3, 1. Okay, write them down. Okay, next set. 7, 4, 1, 3, 9. Write them down. All right, next up. 4, 9, 7, 2, 1, 5. Write them down. Alrighty, next set. 5, 1, 8, 3, 9, 2, 6. Write them down. Alrighty, next one. 1, 9, 5, 6, 3, 4, 7, 2. Write them down. Okie dokie. Next one. 3, 6, 2, 5, 1, 9, 7, 4, 8. Write them down. Alrighty, last one I'm gonna do. 6, 1, 5, 4, 9, 8, 3, 2, 8, 7. Write them down. All right, I didn't do the 11 because I didn't want to torture y'all. But here are the correct answers for those. So did anybody get 9? That's within the plus or minus 2. Did anyone get the span of 9? Yeah, Haley, looks like you did pretty well there. So it looks like nobody got 9. Did anybody get 8, the span of 8? Yep, that's really common, Carter. Oh, nice. Someone got all of them. Someone lost it at 7. Sweet. Yeah. So again, it's typically pretty easy. Up to about the 6-digit span. 7, we tend to do okay, right? And then it gets beyond our capacity. It's really difficult to remember unless you're someone with just a good short-term memory. Like everything else we talked about this semester, there are individual differences. And it looks like we've got some people. Davion did really well. 8 of them. Barking dog. Yeah, that could be a problem too, right? So this is something we have to watch in psychology research. So I know someone who studies memory, attention, things like that. And they actually had to throw out half a semester's worth of data because they decided, and not they, but the campus decided it was a good idea to start construction right next to the building where they were trying to do this experiment. And so they realized like everything was just corrupted by the fact that people were distracted by the pounding and the whirring and whatnot. So yeah, distractions make a big difference as well. If the fire alarm had gone off in the middle of that, if we were on campus, right, you all would have had a hard time. I would have had a hard time. So again, this idea of like we can remember a certain amount and then beyond that, we're just over the capacity of our short-term memory. Okay. So now we'll talk about encoding and storage in working memory. So we've talked about chunking just a few minutes ago, right? Putting things into easily remembered chunks, like those digits, first 3, then next 3, then last 4 of a phone number. Maintenance rehearsal is the process where you repeat the information or reviewing it to keep it from fading while in working memory. So again, me saying 583 UGG, 583 UGG, right? Studying is often maintenance rehearsal, right? If you're doing flashcards or like saying things out loud to yourself or writing stuff down. I always thought that my neighbors probably thought it was crazy in grad school because the way I would study would be to like say things out loud and they're probably like, is this woman talking to herself? Is she okay? And then elaborative rehearsal is where we actively review it and we relate it to the information. In long-term memory, we make that deep semantic connection that helps it get encoded and put into storage in long-term memory. Like sensory memory, working memory has modality-specific parts that we as psychologists love to give fancy names to. So there is a central executive, and that is what directs our attention to what we need to pay attention to in the input, in that sensory memory. So it controls the deployment of attention. So it'll switch the focus of attention and divide your attention as needed. So for example, maintenance rehearsal is the best way to remember stuff. Yeah, so like, Haley getting her dog barking, right? Like, yeah, that's something that's going to distract you because your brain is going to be like, I need to pay attention to that because what if my dog needs to go outside? Or what if there's an intruder, right? That's the central executive, flipping your memory, flipping your attention, sorry. Which, as we talked about already, can then affect your memory. The phonological loop temporarily stores sound. So that's what you all were using when I was saying the numbers out loud. It facilitates the acquisition of language in general. It's where you hold verbal information. And it's what we thought was the entirety of short-term memory before we started doing more research and discovering there's other ways we hold information. But we used to think that it was only sort of a phonological loop. The sketchpad lets us store and manipulate visual images. The episodic buffer helps us to remember events that are happening. So it's a limited capacity store that allows the various components of working memory to integrate information and serves as an interface between working memory and long-term memory. And then the semantic buffer is what helps us get that deep processing to attach meaning to words. So obviously, if we want to encrypt a thing into long-term memory, the semantic buffer is very important. So this next diagram shows us all the ways that working memory interacts, all these different components interact. So we get the stimulation from outside of us, or sometimes it's within us, right? If you have something internal going on you need to pay attention to. That goes into your sensory memory, and that goes to the central executive. And the central executive kind of decides, what do we need to pay attention to? What can we just sort of let slip by us? So we get the semantic buffer for word meanings going on. We get the phonological loop for those sounds going on. We get the sketchpad for those visual things going on, and the episodic buffer for events going on. Now, this shows those as separate things, but they can obviously also interact, right? So if we are seeing an image and hearing a related sound, right, the phonological loop and the sketchpad are going to like be coordinated and make it even easier. I don't know who else took languages in middle school, high school, and had to take like an annual exam for it. I know we did when I took French, and every single time the little example question was a picture of an elephant, and it's there were other pictures of animals too, and it just said an elephant, it said it just like that. I still remember an elephant, which just means elephant is. And so then you had to picture the picture of the elephant. So that's obviously in my long-term memory as a result. And then the episodic buffer will help put things into episodic long-term memory where we remember about events that happen to us. The sketchpad will help put things into visual long-term memory. The phonological loop, the sounds, will be processed into long-term memory for sounds or language. And then the semantic buffer will interact with that visual long-term memory for words as well, but again, ascribing meaning, helping us remember them much more clearly. So all these things will interact to help put it into long-term memory, and then obviously to help us retrieve it down the road. So I'm going to stop there for today, just because long-term memory has several slides, and I don't think we would get through them all, and I'd like to sort of do it as a chunk. So you all are free to head out and get a little R&R between this and your next class. And I will do my typical hanging around if anybody has any questions. Everybody has fun playing with your short-term memories over the next couple days. And I'll see you on Wednesday.
Question.